Welcome to our Reopening Schools Forum. I am State Representative Christine Drazan, and I represent House District 39 in the state legislature. My community that I represent includes Charbonneau, Canby, Barlow, rural Oregon City, all the way over to the beautiful community of Estacada and down to Malino. I am joined today by Colt Gill, the Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of Oregon, who also serves as the Director of the Oregon Department of Education. Mr. Gill has been an educator for 28 years. His career in education began in 1988 when he was hired to teach 4th and 5th grade at Cress Lane Elementary School in Cresswell, Oregon. He served as a teacher, principal, district technology director, curriculum and instruction director, assistant superintendent, and superintendent. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Oregon in his home community of Lane County. I am also so pleased to welcome Estacada School District Superintendent Ryan Carpenter. Mr. Carpenter joined the Estacada School District as a social studies teacher and baseball coach during the fall of 2009. In his years as an educator, Mr. Carpenter served as a high school principal, vice principal, athletic director, teacher, and coach. And in 2016, he was named the Oregon Future Business Leader of America Principal of the Year. Ryan lives in Estacada with his wife and his 3 kids, and I just want to say thank you both for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be with us today. I am a mom of 3 kids. My kiddos have gone through the Canby public school systems, and in this time I have watched my own family experience both Canby's distance learning program and our online learning academy. I am a strong proponent of returning to in-person instruction, and I'm anxious to get questions in from our community today. Our format today is going to be entirely Q&A. The questions have been forwarded to my office through Facebook and in direct email messages, text messages, calls, and I'm going to do my absolute best to get everyone's questions in. For any questions we're not able to get to today, I'll be posting on our event page in Facebook, and we'll do our absolute best to get those questions answered. And with that, I am going to get started because we have so much ground to cover. So I have consolidated and edited questions to allow us to get to as many as we can. So I am actually going to start with a question for Superintendent Carpenter.
Okay, I'm ready.
Estacada School District is back.
Yes.
You're there for in-person learning for your youngest kiddos.
Yes.
So one of the questions that we had was what variables had to be present to allow you to move ahead? What have you learned? And what challenges lie ahead for you?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this great conversation and be able to just really speak to community members as well as parents about how reopening is going to look both in Clackamas County and in your local school districts alike. The Estacada School District did successfully complete last week its first beginning to hybrid reopening, which we welcome back to our kindergarten and first graders on campus, which was just such a breath of fresh air. The feeling and the excitement around just having students back in the classrooms was just fantastic. And I first must just give credit to our great teachers and our great building leaders and all of the support staff who helped pull this off, as well as our parents who played such a vital role in ensuring that students were coming to campus safe and ready to go and in compliance with both of our expectations to make this a safe spot so that Estacada can continue to stay open. It's really been a long journey for the Estacada School District, and fortunately, to your question of how we kind of got the ball rolling towards opening was really trying to just stick with the Ready School, Safe Learners guidelines that were provided from the Department of Education. And Estacada has always stayed consistent that we were going to continuously follow the metrics. That's where the science has indicated has been a safe spot for us to be moving forward. We have been very diligent in ensuring that all of the protocols are met, and of course we're meeting with our employees regularly to ensure that their voices are being heard so that when they return, they're returning to a feeling of a safe atmosphere and a welcoming atmosphere as well. And so, as the vaccine and as some of the other things has emerged, those are all great things that our school district very much supports our employees having access to. But at the end of the day, the science is telling us that the age group of kindergarten through first grade is a good spot to start. We're obviously monitoring and measuring everything as a part of that process, and we've been able to successfully work with all of our labor associations to welcome those students back this week.
Thank you so much for that. I will have a follow-up question later about your communications
You
with
bet.
your teachers' unions, and that was a point of discussion and questions as well.
Yeah.
So I'd like to bounce over to Mr. Gill. Again, thank you for being here today. The state of Oregon has received or will receive considerable funding to support COVID protocols. With this in mind, and with Governor Brown's decision to prioritize teachers to receive vaccines, I had a question about one of the biggest school districts in the state not allowing middle and high school students back into the classroom this year, even when other larger districts are providing some kind of in-person learning. The general question was, are there consequences for districts who make the decision to slow roll the reopening despite guidance from the Oregon Department of Education and direction from the governor? Will the governor withhold state or federal funding for any schools for failure to come back into the classroom this year?
Thank you, Representative Drazan. So at this time, the state made a pretty significant shift when we rolled out the most recent set of guidance. So Governor Brown changed the guidance from what was mandatory previously, meaning schools could not open until they met the metrics that Superintendent Carpenter was talking about, but they could choose to stay closed if that was what made sense for their communities. So now those metrics are advisory. And again, districts have local decision making, so local school boards have the power to determine when it is that they open. We're hopeful that they follow the science and use those metrics in both directions, but both that they use them to determine when they can reduce risk enough to make it as safe as possible to return, and that when they've reached that hurdle, that they do open to in-person instruction. Now, different districts do have different challenges that they face in terms of group sizes and cohorts within the guidance, and we are continuing to work on each of those issues to see if we can make changes in the guidance that makes it easier for some of our larger districts, especially to open. But right now it is a local decision.
Thank you. So I'll go back to you, Mr. Carpenter. So tell me, if we could talk just a little bit more, how did you involve your teachers in discussions related to reopening? And if this was done, and it sounds like it was, what mechanisms have you put in place to ensure that this dialogue continues?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Obviously, to have our employee workforce, support our efforts to reopen our schools, it was a long process, and really it's been throughout the beginning of the school year. So speaking to Estacada specific, there was a time this summer where there was some opportunity for school districts to make a choice, either to open in hybrid or to open in comprehensive distance learning. And so really after, kind of having conversations with the Estacada community specifically, it was abundantly clear that Estacada wanted its schools to remain open to the safest extent possible. Towards the end of the summer is really when the introduction of metrics came about. And so really it's been the Estacada School District's mindset and planning is to open up in this hybrid model through the conception of bringing students back safely. And so as we continue to follow the metrics really throughout the entire process, we've been always engaging with our employee workforce, that being teachers, bus drivers, cooks, custodians, because oftentimes we're talking about teachers, but there's so much more that makes a school district successfully run who we've been working with. And so just some things that we've put in place to capture that employee voice is monthly we've been doing employee forums hosted by the superintendent where all employees had the opportunity through Zoom to be able to express concerns and get some of their questions answered. And so we were doing that on a frequent basis. Also our department directors as well as our building principals have their own leadership teams. And so we've been collecting voice throughout the process to make sure that any safety fears could be mitigated, any risks could be mitigated so that we could, successfully launch what we had been planning for really all year long, which occurred last week. And that's the beginning of the kindergarten hybrid. So it's been a year-long effort. There's been a tremendous amount of changes and flux to the roller coaster that we've all been a part of. And each and every superintendent and their leadership team is working as hard as they can to try to support the reintroduction of kids on campus. For us, we were fortunate to have a lot of platforms like safety committees and safety teams that kind of help us get there. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mr. Gill, you mentioned a little bit about the metric shifting from over to advisory metrics. So there was a question that came in that said, now that the metrics have changed and they're in advisory instead of mandatory, there remain two overall issues. Why did the state retain reopening metrics at all, as most states do not have them? And why, if the metrics are retained, didn't the Oregon Department of Education make it clear that opening schools without meeting the advisory goals would not trigger liability under state law?
Okay, thanks for that question. So I want to tackle the first part of that first. So most states, I believe, actually do have metrics that they offer as guidance, but it is a local decision to return to in-person instruction. There are two things to consider as you begin to open up schools to in-person instruction. One of those is all the public health and safety protocols that help to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 when you are on site. Schools are really good at that. Schools are not super spreader locations, as we're finding out, but only if they include all those health and safety protocols, the face coverings, physical distancing, reducing the size of cohorts so not very many people are impacted when a case does come into a school. Doing the cleaning and disinfecting, having strong health screening, as folks enter the school each and every day. And those are challenging to implement. So I know that Superintendent Carpenter has been doing it for a week with kindergarten and first grade. And surprisingly, as we found out from most of our schools, and he can comment on how this has been going for his group, the kids tend to be able to follow those rules rather well. We teach them a lot of rules and protocols at school, like walking in a line. So now we're teaching them how to walk in a line and be 6 feet apart. When those things are in place, we can do a really good job of mitigating the spread. But the other part that is really critical is how many people are going to enter the school every day with the possibility of having COVID. Schools in Oregon have been open to in-person instruction since the beginning of the school year. So on average, we've had about 60,000 students a week. Since January, it's been closer to about 85,000 students attending in-person instruction. And we have had a number of cases in our schools. So about 220 of our schools have experienced COVID-19 at the school site, sometimes with multiple people. We have seen very little spread of COVID-19 in a school setting from one person to another. But schools need to be ready for that. And that's the reason the metrics matter so much, is that if you have very high levels of COVID-19 in your local community, you're going to be bringing COVID-19 regularly into the school and having the chance that it could move from one person to another. So that's why we continue to have metrics. And then Representative Drazan, can you remind me of the second part related to liability? I don't think I quite heard that full question.
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely a two-parter, wasn't it? So the question was, if the metrics are retained, why didn't the Oregon Department of Education make clear that opening schools, even though all the standards were now advisory, would not trigger liability under state law, as in they're still protected under the liability protections, even though it's still advisory? Thank you.
Yeah, so the Department of Education did add a new section to the guidance to clarify that school districts, as far as the state is concerned, are only required to follow the requirements, and that anything that is not labeled as a requirement and even has a little symbol for what a requirement is, a little checkbox that you must follow. Everything else is considered advisory or recommended, and none of those items are required by the state. They're at the discretion of the local district. And we'd go so far as to say, in fact, most schools could not follow all of those recommendations. Some of them are for specific settings that exist in some schools and not in others, or on some buses and not in others. So they're all things for people to think about, but they are not requirements. So the Department of Education did do its best to name that the metrics are advisory, and that local school districts could also consider even more localized information that they may be able to get from their local public health authority that aren't at the full county level, but at a community level. that they could consider the academic needs of their students, the social, emotional, and mental health needs of their students as they make their decisions. So I think that that's clear from the guidance. There is still some clarity that may be needed in that law.
So I'm sorry, Mr. Gill, but I think that the question they were trying to get at was the question of whether or not schools are now exposed to liability now that the guidance is advisory. Could you briefly respond to that concern?
Right. So they're in Oregon. So just, I guess, to back up, we have 197 school districts. 194 of them have been receiving their liability insurance from a single carrier, PACE, who's run out of the Oregon School Boards Association. That carrier in June let the school districts know that they would no longer cover liability insurance for communicable diseases, including COVID-19. And apparently this is not unusual around the world, that many of the insurance carriers are no longer providing liability insurance for communicable disease. When that happened, we went forward with schools, and schools were making independent decisions on whether they would choose to open with or without that liability insurance that was previously available to them. Then during a special session of the Oregon legislature, the legislature passed a bill to have some limited liability protections for school districts so that the liability would be less of a concern for them. The department did not create that legislation. That was created by other parties and passed by the legislature. In that legislation, it calls for school districts to follow all guidance, so inclusive of recommendations and advisory guidance, as well as what the state is actually requiring. So again, the only thing that the state could do, that the Department of Education could do, was to be very clear about what's actually required and what's not. So we made it very clear that the metrics are advisory, that they're a local district decision. And then those districts will need to work with their attorneys to determine whether they fit within the coverage of that new piece of legislation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Gill. So, Mr. Carpenter, my friend, I am going to ask you a question about sports.
Okay.
So, as you can only imagine, there's so much interest in getting kids back on the fields, on the courts, back engaged in their extracurricular activities for their own mental health and social well-being. And so you coached.
Yes.
You were the athletic director. You get the value and the importance of this stuff. So talk to me a little bit about this. So how can we get Oregon's sports seasons back in some form? What's the plan for youth sports? Where are we at? Any thoughts on band, theater, all the things that draw our kids into the classroom with joy?
Yeah, excellent questions. And I know that that's a question burning on the hearts and minds of not only parents, but aspiring athletes and people who just want to connect with their friends and participate in activity. Thankfully, the metrics to reopen OSAA-sponsored athletics is really contingent upon county metrics, different than the school metrics. And so I think it's important for parents to understand that even though metrics may look different for how schools are operating, the actual athletic metrics are coupled with the county at the moment, which based on Clackamas County or the Portland metro area, hinders the ability for any type of indoor athletics at this point. That being said, our school districts and school districts around the metro area are relatively optimistic at the moment about giving and providing some opportunities for students to participate. In Estacada and another Clackamas County's area school districts, students have been participating in some very safe and controlled practices outdoors. In Estacada, even our basketball teams were safely practicing, at a distance in our elementary outdoor basketball hoops and in some of our outdoor parks, just again to have the opportunity to connect, to refine some of their skills and be out there. And so in Estacada, we are seeing lots of students have the opportunity to do that. Just this last weekend, Estacada School District conducted its musical, which was The Addams Family. Obviously, we had to be innovative in how we did that, and so we didn't allow any spectators into the auditorium, but people were able to purchase cardboard cutouts of themselves to be in the auditorium so that the revenue could still be made from the program so that we could prepare for next year's, and then folks could purchase and live stream online. And so I really do believe that school districts in general are trying to be as innovative as they can to foster this play and to foster this activity. It's definitely not going to look like you would imagine a Friday night football game is going to look like this year. But at the end of the day, we're optimistic to try to make that happen. I also, by the way, have a 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 7-year-old who does participate in youth athletics. And at this point, I am optimistic of a potential spring sport. I think that if you're thinking about potentially salvaging a youth basketball season, that's probably out of the works at this point, but a lot of youth organizations are starting to kind of gear up again and see how they can safely serve and support kids, because it's not just about the athletics or the activities, it's also about the social emotional needs of our kids. And so we're very much in support of getting activities going again.
Yay! So,
Yeah.
I mean, so many families are crossing state lines with club sports right now.
Yes.
I don't see how that's necessarily better. So I'm super anxious to have seasons here locally as well.
Yes.
You know, while I've got you, that was a nice brief response. I'm going to sneak in a second one.
Sure. Okay.
It should be easier. So, are there any requirements for ventilation systems in your schools when you return to in-person learning? And also, what are the requirements, if any, for ongoing system checks to ensure safe, functional systems?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes is the answer to that. And I'm not the expert to be able to tell you like the actual intakes and outtakes of oxygen and that kind of stuff. We're thankful in our district and in other school districts throughout the state to have people who could answer that better than I. But at the end of the day, it is our school district's commitment to make sure that our HVAC systems are up to date, and we're utilizing some of the great opportunities provided by state legislature, who has freed up some opportunity dollars for us to improve that and upgrade that, as well as some of the ESSER funds that are coming from the federal government as well. Like, for example, the Estacada School District and many other school districts in Clackamas County have aging buildings and facilities. And so we've made it a high priority to make sure that we're regularly changing our filters. In the Estacada School District, we're doing a 30% air exchange, and so that we're exchanging the entire air really 3 times a day in each classroom, and 30% of the air that's coming into classrooms is coming from the outside. And this is great because it makes our employees feel safe and it makes our parents feel safe that they're sending their students to a classroom that is getting well ventilated. However, it makes a classroom really cold. And as we start welcoming back our students into a cold classroom in the wintertime, we're trying to find new innovative opportunities to warm up the classroom so it's conducive to high leverage learning, all while keeping the ventilation there. So we are actually approving through some of our ESSER funds and the money afforded to us through some of the emergency state dollars that you've provided as well, is to do some ionization projects. And so we've got some electromagnetic something, this is where it gets past me, but it's reaching out and ultimately trying to evaporate some of those harmful toxins in the air as well. And so we're optimistic about HVAC. I think it's a legitimate question and concern, but rest assured that school districts are working with their employees as well as experts to make sure that the schools are safe when children return.
It seems pretty fast and easy if you just gave everybody Bernie mittens.
Yes,
Just-
there you go.
We'll just, all be cozied up with our Bernie mittens. So thank you
Yes.
for that.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Gill, I'm back to you. I have a very quick question for you as well. What is the guidance around class sizes for online learning? We had someone who forwarded a question with a concern because their first grader had 48 students in an online setting. I'm wondering, how widespread is this, and how can it be addressed?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. 48, I agree. That seems far too many for an online setting for first grade in particular. I have not heard about a first grade class being that size, although I will say that before COVID-19, virtual schools that have operated in Oregon do sometimes have very large class sizes. Oregon does not currently have any statute or legislation around class size. So that's something that could continue to be considered. But during COVID-19, our schools who have offered what we call comprehensive distance learning have a whole nother set of requirements that's different than what was typically available in virtual or online schools prior to COVID-19. And they require things like daily synchronous or live activities between the educator and the student, and between students as well. So they have peer-to-peer interaction, and a number of other requirements to help make that as effective as possible, and and allow for contact between, again, educators and students each and every day. I have not heard in comprehensive distance learning models of first grade classrooms of 48. My wondering is if this is related to the possible of an announcement of a school district that may be going back to in-person or into hybrid, and some information that maybe the district has, whatever district this was, put out related to how individual families and students choose to participate in school. So for many of our districts, as they begin to operate in person or in a hybrid model, they're still offering, or may be required to offer, families the opportunity to stay in distance learning. And that does cause staffing challenges for our schools. So some of them are having to change the teacher that the student has been working with in the first half of the year. And some of them may be giving out information around what class sizes might look like. But again, I'd be happy to hear more about that particular situation.
Yeah, thank you. I would be happy to reach out and connect that person.
Sure. I could actually like to add on,
Yeah,
because
please.
Director Gill is right on the money. My guess is this has more to do with the transition to hybrid learning as well. And as we transition, and this is occurring, I know, in Central and Eastern Oregon quite a bit, but as we start to transition as well, there are families who are still electing to be able to stay 100% online. All the meanwhile, we don't have necessarily the capacity due to the safety protocols to allow all students back into the classroom. And so hybrid days such as A days and B days, and our families will become more and more accustomed to that. There's a need to be able to have half of the class in that normal classroom setting present on campus, and then the other half of that class is online in conjunction with those who are electing to stay 100% online. And I will say to those families that this is really a really positive option, is this model allows parents to make the best decision for them, and school districts are working hard to try to accommodate those desires of the families and still offer robust and high educational opportunities. And so I do ask those parents, because there may be occasions where there are 48 students in an online class, and I know that school districts, including ours, are working hard to support that class with more adults and more breakout group opportunities. To really reduce the size of what looks like a large classroom at the time. But I just ask parents to remain patient. It's going to get better. We started to get a good routine, and we're getting pretty good at comprehensive distance learning. Now we're starting to transition to a form of on-campus learning, something that we haven't done before either. And so I just ask that you give patience and grace to your child's teacher and to our elementary schools and other schools that do open, because we will get this, but there will be some bumps as we transition.
Thank you for that. That's good clarification. I appreciate that. So I am going to, I think, go back to Mr. Gill. If you're up for one more, I feel like you're getting the lion's share of this. A lot of these are large questions. So there was some curiosity and some questions around testing. So the one that I want to ask you about is what is the Oregon Department of Education's long-term plan to address students who have been left behind academically in this prior year? And is there a plan to do an assessment so that we can really fully understand what the learning loss has been? Or maybe to put it a little bit better is to say just where are students at as we transition back to in-person learning and move forward from here?
Great question. And thanks for clarifying, because when you first talked about testing, I think about COVID-19 a lot. So I thought it would be about COVID-19 testing in schools, which is also an opportunity that we have now. But academic assessments for students. So one thing that I want to assure you of and your constituents is that our schools, the teachers, they do have an understanding of the learning that has been happening for students and the progress of that learning and what the learning loss may be. So while last year we did not do a statewide summative assessment because our students were learning from home, and I'll talk a little bit about what those challenges are in just a minute here. We did use some of those funds to purchase interim assessments so that they would be available for every district that doesn't already use their own. So most districts in Oregon already have an interim assessment system. They use a variety of tools for that, some that are developed here in Oregon and others that are developed by companies in other states, where they regularly assess students on their progress towards state standards in shorter bursts of assessments that can be done through distance learning. And so that educators, the teachers working with those students immediately know where those students are at and how they're progressing, and then they can design instruction to help them meet their needs. So that is in place, and we ensured for the districts that didn't have access to their own tool that we purchased one for them. And I think that's the most critical piece. Now, we last spring did not do a statewide summative assessment. This spring, we don't plan to do that either. The statewide summative assessment under the federal rules is a fairly lengthy assessment. So it's several hours of students at computers sharing their knowledge from a year's worth of learning in mathematics, English language arts, reading and writing, and science. It's challenging. It requires specific technologies that not all of our students have at home, and it requires some bandwidth that not all of our students have at home. So we feel like if we delivered that assessment and we tried to do it from home, several things would happen. So we don't have somebody there that's ensuring that it's only the students' work. We don't have someone there that's can handle the technology support for students when they get stuck or when something's not moving on the computer. And we can't guarantee that every student would participate. So we think any kind of statewide data we received from that would most likely give us a false sense of security around learning loss. So we would receive information about students who were doing fairly well and who had full access to all the technology that they needed. So we are again seeking a waiver from the federal government so that we don't offer that statewide summative assessment. In place of it, we are trying to put out a survey to students and families to understand what their access to learning has been like during this time, and hope to learn from that so that we can make improvements for the future, and then lean on those interim, those shorter assessments that directly inform their teachers and their school about how they're doing on learning. The one last thing I just want to add to that is that, and again, Superintendent Carpenter talked a little bit about this, but we do have more federal funds coming into the state and to each school in Oregon, each public school. So they'll all be receiving their share of about $450 million over the next couple of weeks. They can use those funds to think about learning loss as well. So they can have credit recovery options for high school students. They can think about a fifth term or a summer school supports for students as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. So this is where I am going to jump in. I hadn't actually planned to do this, but it's interesting as a state legislator and as a mom of kids that have gone through this experience. My daughter happens to be in the Online Learning Academy. And so if you go to the parent portal for the Online Learning Academy, it shows that she has no grade, no testing, no assessments, just perfect attendance. Now, she doesn't have perfect attendance, and she has, in fact, taken quizzes, and she has done work over the course of this year. And not to be unkind towards the overall system, but I would say that that's dramatically inadequate for anyone to know where my daughter is. And to assume that we don't need a statewide test because the issues which are, in fact, relevant and in place every single day that we've been in the hybrid or online version of education this entire year, which include you don't know that it's only students taking the test, there is no resource for technology supports for the student, and that only some students are actually participating over the course of this year. Those are precisely the challenges that have caused so many parents to be concerned about the online education environment we've offered for our students this year. So as a legislator, I would hope that question of whether or not we do assessments could be reevaluated, and here's why. Originally, my thinking on this was it's so important to just get kids back in the classroom. Let's not do testing. It's not necessary. They just need to start learning again. Let's get them reconnected. Let's get them started on their work. But I have this feeling that the money that's coming from the federal government, in fact, isn't going to be enough to adequately bring students back up to the learning level that we would consider on track. And I have this other sense that the education community is going to come to legislators and say we need more support. Now, it's going to be really hard for me as a member of the Full Ways and Means Committee to listen to a request for additional support for education when I don't have any idea where student learning is, other than anecdotal information from teachers based on snippets of their sense and their understanding of student learning, when I happen to have a student in my home that I know there is no teacher that will have any sense of where she is on anything, and without her having access to a standardized statewide assessment, they will literally not know. And so I just want to encourage you to reconsider and think about this in a way that allows for the policymakers as well as educators to have a sense of what is the real gap that we actually need to band together to address, and not just political pressure, anecdotal concerns. I would expect that there will be some very real strategies that will take additional money that educators would like to engage to support student learning. At this point, additional supports, the compensatory learning that you get for kids that are in your individual education plans, I expect lots of kids are going to need some equivalent of that. And without additional resources and without a basis to support those additional resources, it's going to be an interesting conversation. And so I actually hadn't planned to jump in with any particular input, but I do think that if we don't do some version of a statewide assessment in this school year, after not doing one last school year, we're talking about catching back up after 3 years the next time we do one. Those are different students. And so I hope that could be reconsidered. I understand the need for time. I understand the technology challenges. But if we go back to in-person, maybe there's an opportunity to do that in a classroom setting. So some of those concerns are addressed. But everything that you listed is precisely all of the things that are currently present every single day in a student's life when they've been at home in an online learning setting since March. So I appreciate that. Thank you for indulging me. Mr. Carpenter, I have a question for you that's kind of related to that issue.
Sure.
So can you tell me, how has Estacada addressed inequities for minorities, students with disabilities, houseless students, and students below the poverty line during this time and moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question, and it's a really big challenge for not just the Estacada School District, but really all school districts, not only through the state, but through the country as well. We actually do believe that we have found some successful models that has allowed us to really engage with different groups of demographics, in particularly our students of color and our economically disadvantaged students. Obviously in Estacada and some parts of Clackamas County, we were also affected by a pretty substantial wildfire this year. And so, for about 2 weeks, the Estacada School District, the entire school district, was displaced due to evacuation. And so that required really a lot of our support staff, including teachers and administrators, counselors, social workers, et cetera, to really begin a very robust outreach program to make sure that our students were evacuating safely in a safe place and still had the opportunity to access their education and to access their teacher. And so we've been doing a lot of home visits. We've been tracking attendance and engagement in all of our classrooms. I'm actually very proud to say that the Estacada School District, that's something that we monitor regularly and have had collaborative conversations over the course of how to improve that. And right now, the Estacada School District's experiencing a 91% regular attenders rate. believe it or not, our attendance rate is better this year than it has been in our last 4 or 5 years when, quote, normal school was occurring. And I think our counselors and our support staff deserve a tremendous amount of credit because they're being innovative to go meet these house visits and to go just reach out to students and families and support their needs. We're also very closely monitoring. We're a proficiency-based grading school district. And so it's not so much necessarily about are they turning things in. We're truly measuring the Common Core standards and the essential standards that students are there. And so we can report to families just exactly where their students are as well as where their deficits are. And we're learning that through this school year, students are, the pace is slower. Students are learning at a slower pace. Teachers are teaching their units and their essential learning standards at a slower pace. And so there is no doubt that there's going to be a little bit of slide when it comes to the pace of what we're expecting students to learn, to know, and to do. But at the end of the day, I believe that it's this accurate reporting that will allow us to successfully pass on to the next grade level or to the next content the knowledge of where these students are and where they are not, allowing us to close gaps faster. And so I'm actually very pleased, and I can only speak for Estacada schools. I'm sure Director Gill has had opportunities to observe different districts, but we're doing a lot, and the data is telling us that there are some strengths and weaknesses. We're also providing internet to our families who don't have internet access, and we're utilizing some of the ESSER funds to reimburse that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. So, Mr. Gill, the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations have notable differences for mitigation strategies to control the spread of COVID in schools that can be layered to reduce the risk of spread. So since the science from both is well respected, there's another two-part question. I'm going to try to make it easy. First one, how did the Oregon Department of Education choose which set of recommendations to rely on? And the second part of that question is, why can't a middle school or a high school start slowly at the same time that an elementary school might be starting slowly, since they're in different buildings, and bringing them back at a different grade level might also allow them to be in different cohorts at the same time?
Great questions. I'm going to share, this is probably a better question for our state epidemiologists at the Oregon Health Authority, but I will share with you as we're in regular conversations with them. Just know that I'm not an epidemiologist or a public health specialist, so we rely on them quite a bit. On our website, we have a Ready Schools Safe Learners section, and in that section, there is a document that shows the research behind Oregon's health and safety protocols and the metrics that were selected. And you're right, so the experts don't always agree, at least not at the same time. So Oregon right now has metrics for returning to in-person instruction that are much more permissive than the CDC's. The CDC is the metrics that we followed in November and December. And then when we switched over in January, we now follow the Harvard Global Health Institute metrics, which move us from 200 cases per 100,000 people over the last 14 days to 350. So quite a bit more permissive. Some of the other differences that you'll see is how big a cohort or a pod or a bubble should be, so a group of students. They all use different terminology for that as well. How far apart students need to be during most of their school day. So those things are changing with different groups. So some of them are still calling for 2 meters, which is about 6 feet. Some of them call for 3 feet at different times. So we continue to rely on the folks at the Oregon Public Health Authority to help guide us through those decisions. One of the things that happens, and I would just say as folks read these different pieces of guidelines that show up in the headline or the first few paragraphs of a story, is to dig down where they have the link to the actual study that story is referring to, because oftentimes it will tell a lot more about what's actually happening in that event. So when they say it's okay to be, or you need to maintain 6 feet of physical distancing, you also need to think about what is the current community spread, how many people likely have COVID-19 in that area. And what other protocols do they also have in place? So are they maintaining face coverings, and do they have entry screening, and do they have small cohorts so that it doesn't spread from one person to another? So all those are taken into account, and we come up with Oregon's public health and safety protocols, which have been working well. Oregon has one of the lower rates of COVID-19 impacts in hospitalizations and death rates, and the number of people per capita getting the illness. So I think the Oregon Health Authority has been doing a good job with that, as challenging as it is. The reason that there are different numbers for elementary versus high school and middle school, or the reason to say start at elementary first, is because younger children, ages 10 to 12 and younger, don't tend to get the disease as frequently. They don't tend to pass it on to others as readily. And it's generally a group that you don't have to have as many protocols in place to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 as you do for older students who behave with the disease in similar ways to adults. The other challenge, and this is the really big one, is that when you're in a middle school and high school, it's very hard to keep a small cohort together the whole day. So in elementary school, typically it is mostly in one classroom, and those students only impact each other. In a middle school and high school setting, students oftentimes travel from class to class throughout the day through, somewhere between 4 and 8 periods a day. They could be with a different group of people. So if you think about what happens if one person comes to school and they're there for a full day, and the next day, the next day they find out that they are positive for COVID-19. In a high school setting, say that student went to 6 classes. Well, it's likely each of those 6 classes immediately goes into quarantine. They're all sent home. It's very disruptive to the students and the families. And each one of those classrooms also has a teacher who is likely sent home for the day, unless other kinds of protocols are put into place. That teacher teaches that class that the student was in, and then 5 others who weren't impacted. They aren't at risk, but their class goes online as well because the teacher now is forced to teach from home because they're in quarantine. So you have one person that maybe would have impacted just 6 classes, but now they've impacted 31 classes when you count all the other classes that teacher teaches. So it's just a much more challenging setting to do this in middle school and high school, and one that can be very disruptive to students and families and the educational process. So we're trying to find the best ways to mitigate that and to ensure that students have the best possible access to their education, and going back and forth between distance learning and in-person can be challenging.
Thank you. Just very quickly, a very quick follow-up on that. Will the guidance evolve, the Ready School Safe Learners guidance, if there is additional information that comes forward? Will that continue to evolve, or is it steady on for the remainder of this year and the remainder of our experience with COVID?
Yeah, great question. It will definitely continue to evolve. I'm going to name it also, and Superintendent Carpenter may want to speak to this, but it's also a challenge for schools. So it's great that it evolves as we learn more about how COVID behaves. It's the reason that we've been able to move into the classrooms. Oregon's first guidance that took us through the first 2 months of schools was much more restrictive than what Oregon has today. And that's all from these studies that have happened over the last few months. So that's allowed us to make changes. It's also challenging for schools as the rules and the guidelines change on them, and they have to react to these changes and try to make changes within their systems to better serve students.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. I appreciate that. So, Mr. Carpenter, I have a question related to the mental health of our students for you.
Sure.
So, how do you address students who are challenged right now, struggling with mental health concerns? What can a school do in our current environment? What's happening in the community?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a very thoughtful question and heartfelt question, and that's a great challenge for our school district and many others. We know that there are students who are hurting, who are struggling. We're doing what we think is some pretty innovative work to try to get out there and reach all of it. But we also know that reporting to DHS is down roughly 70% of what it normally is, and that's a job that school districts take very seriously, is supporting the safety and well-being of kids. I will say that there's a lot of different ways that school districts are attempting to nurture and support its students and its children. One of those ways is trying to be innovative in making sure that students are fed on a regular basis. The Estacada School District, we've almost, our transportation department, since we no longer transport students as much, we've almost become UPS delivery drivers. And in the Estacada School District, our yellow buses are virtually going door to door, ensuring that our students have the opportunity to receive a free meal and get that nutrition there. It's also a great point of contact from the school district to the family. We've almost guaranteed next day delivery service. So if a child is in one of those remote or virtual classes and they are short a book or short a school supply, our teacher is able to put that into a box, and the very next day that box is delivered on a yellow school bus to our families. And so we are ensuring that all students have the skills and the tools necessary to be successful. And I would say, though, our greatest challenge right now is really that social emotional counseling component to it. And we're just, in some cases, not able to get as deep as we'd like to. We're optimistic as schools begin to start opening up that some of those most vulnerable students, when we talk about limited in-person instruction, those are the types of students that we're trying to target right now to get them on campus and not only get them the mathematic and English and writing skills that they need, but also just to reconnect with an employee or a staff member who they had built a trusting relationship with, so that they can continue to work through some of the challenges that they're experiencing as a young child or as a teenager. And so it's safe to say that there's a lot of different ways that we're trying to approach that. And in some cases they're effective and in others they're not. But I know that school districts, because I meet with other superintendents throughout the state, are never giving up and doing everything that they can to try to reach out to each family.
So I'm going to give you one that might not be that easy to answer today.
Sure, that's okay.
So what do you think the reality is going to be for schools in the fall? Will schools reopen for full-time? Will it be 3 hours a day, 2 days a week?
Yeah.
What's your crystal ball tell us?
Well, fortunately, I have Director Gill with me, who is a big part of my crystal ball. But at this point, I'm optimistic. I really am. I do see the momentum moving in a direction. I believe that allowing access and opportunity for our educators to have a chance at the COVID vaccine, I think, is a tremendous step in the right direction to allowing our employees to feel safe to return. I think that's only going to further school districts' opportunities to welcome students back on campus. I think that communities in general are starting to understand their role in preventing spread as well. And over the last 2 or 3 weeks, specifically in Clackamas County, we're starting to see the case counts reduce. And I just want to say thank you to you. You can agree or disagree with protocols and procedures as much as you'd like. I do believe that communities are starting to become a team and doing their part to reduce that. And every case that goes down is a greater opportunity for school districts to open. Obviously, as the metrics, as we learn more about what other states are doing and other successful things that are occurring throughout the United States, our state is making adjustments and trying to emulate some of the good things happening around. And Director Gill's answer to the changing of metrics is one great example of that. And the thing that the Estacada School District has done, a lot of school districts are tying their reopening to vaccinations and some other things that are provided to them. The Estacada School District is going to continue to wrap its opening towards the metrics. And the reason why behind that is throughout this pandemic, it's been the most consistent and it's been the simplest to communicate to our families and our community. And so, we're going to continue to work towards vaccinating as many people as we possibly can, and you can count all of us in as supporters of making that happen. But at the end of the day, we're going to try to be consistent. And to answer your question, I am optimistic that there will be kids in school next fall, pending we all continue to do our part.
Thank you. So I'm going to circle back around. This might be one of our last questions, Mr. Gill, and it relates to questions around leadership. The governor recently made the decision to prioritize teachers in hopes that that would allow more confidence going back into the classroom. It doesn't sound like there was necessarily an agreement at that time that any teacher who received the vaccine would then be willing to go back into the classroom. But it does bring up this larger issue of leadership around questions of what our schools look like going into the future. Technically, the governor is our superintendent of public instruction in the state of Oregon. And so as different districts across the state make these local decisions, how do you find that balance point between providing the kind of leadership that creates a sense of urgency around getting back in the classroom safely and lowering barriers to ensure that teachers and staff and families are comfortable getting back in the classroom, and using every tool in the toolbox out of the executive branch to ensure that that happens, with this question of, in the end, it really is a local decision. How do you find that balance point? Because I think that families that I have heard from are anxious to feel a sense of leadership, that there is a deep commitment from the top down to do everything we can to get kids back in the classroom. And we have local schools around here that have delayed reopening an additional month, and then there's not a lot of certainty that it won't be delayed beyond that. And so I'm just looking to you to better understand how you view this larger question of leadership.
Yeah, so I think that Governor Brown has actually named the priority for in-person instruction in a way that has created urgency around it. She's put out multiple changes just over the last few weeks alone, from the last couple of weeks of December in through January. We've altered the metrics so that they're more permissive. They're on a different set of guidelines that's more permissive than the CDC, but still within some guidelines from, again, Harvard the Health Institute. She has also prioritized vaccinations in Oregon, which is not the same as what's happening in other states. So our educators have a first shot at getting the vaccine. Many educators across the state have been received their first shot now, and over the next couple of weeks, many more will. All of these are designed to get students to schools to a place where students can return to in-person instruction later this winter and early this spring. I do think that for the governor, those tools were ones that she could invoke right now. I think that she's still looking through that toolbox and is ready to bring out more. We're always trying to find this balance, I'm going to say, between local control and state control. In Oregon, there is a lot of local control. So school boards run local school districts, and they work with superintendents to make decisions about public health and safety at that local level. And they're guided by the work of the state. And the governor will continue to look at different tools that she has to help districts move through processes to return to in-person instruction whenever it can be done safely.
Thank you. I think that we are going to need to wrap it up at that point today. And what I would like to do is just make a few closing comments. And we all know that the CDC has made it clear that it's critical for our schools to open as safely and as quickly as possible for in-person learning. And states across the nation, of course, are opening for in-person learning. Dr. Fauci, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the CDC, everyone agrees that there's urgency, that we get our kids back in the classroom. And of course, Oregon students and families see this and are anxious to get Oregon back on track. I want to thank both of you for sharing that commitment, for being willing to have this conversation today with members of the community, and to be open to these questions that you didn't see in advance and weren't prepped for, and to sort of be on the fly with how we respond to these things. And I would like to also recognize that we had more questions than we had time for today. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to keep both of you guys on the hook and forward those questions to you and get responses back. And then I'll post them on our Facebook page, on the event page for this. And that way anyone who didn't hear their question come up today will see a response from one of the two of you or both of you, and make sure that we get all of these questions answered. It's just a critical time to continue to maintain open lines of communication. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of uncertainty. When I was reviewing some of the materials that our schools have to go through, I was stunned. It was layer upon layer upon layer of guidance, recommendations, and that doesn't even begin to touch on the federal requirements around some of our students that have additional protections throughout their educational careers. And so it is complex at all levels. It's complex bureaucratically, but for families that are seeing a school year slip away, there's no getting back that third grade year. There's no getting back that senior year of high school. And so we really appreciate your partnership in this work, and we look forward to maintaining open lines of communication. And thank you again for being here today.
Thank you.